welcome back to the Infodump, the series where I do a deep but not necessarily scholarly dive into a topic. This week we're going to be continuing with our first topic, physics. But before I get to that, I just want to apologize real quick. The gameplay that you're seeing here, if you are watching the video, is, you can see I'm sort of, moving my mouse around. She's like, oh, look, here's what I did. It's not that I played this game between recordings. It's that I forgot to hit record. So I spent half an hour working on this game. But now you get to just see the finished solutions to a few of the levels. Obviously, Space Chem is a puzzle game, yes, but it's a puzzle game where each puzzle has multiple possible solutions. So these are just my solutions. They're the ones I ended up with. Unfortunately, you guys don't get to see the process behind it. But even so, the Space Chem gameplay is mostly just meant to be there as a sort of background to what I'm, doing with my voice here. So, yes, the ancient Greeks. You may recall we left off last week after establishing that the ancient Greeks were absolute idiots who were also lucky enough to stumble across key insights and literate enough to record them. Unlike many of their contemporaries. Of course, all of what I said last week mostly applies to the Athenians rather than to all ancient Greeks. Ancient Greece was actually a disparate mess of city-states, united in language, but definitely not in culture. Everyone knows about the old Athens-Sparta rivalry. Hell, there's even a video game about it, albeit a ridiculously ahistorical one, in the form of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. But what is perhaps somewhat less well known is that those sorts of rivalries cropped up pretty much everywhere. And it wasn't until the aftermath of the First War with the Persian Empire that the city-states had mostly aligned themselves with either Athens or Sparta. Think of it a bit like the Cold War, with these minor countries getting forcibly dragged into one of the two spheres of influence. And before you try and, flood the comments with, Athens was the good guy, or Sparta is the good guy, or anything like that, it's worth noting that both Athens and Sparta were pretty horrible. Athens, of course, was very upright and self-centered. It kind of says something that 90% of Athenian, theater and such is some degree of satire of Athens. And it's always about how big their ego is. Which, I guess in that sense, you really could compare Athens to the US. People like to say that Athens is great because they invented democracy. Their democracy was, if you are rich, landowning, and male, you may vote. If you are a woman, not only are you property, you are not to be seen in public ever. And if you are a slave, technically you can buy your freedom, but probably more likely it'll be your great-grandchildren being able to buy their freedom with everything that you've saved up, plus everything your children save up, plus everything your grandchildren save up, plus everything that they save up. So, yeah, it's not like Athens is flat out the good guys in history. Likewise, Sparta aren't flat out the good guys or flat out the bad guys. They were very militaristic, which, depending on your personal worldview, could be either a good thing or a bad thing. But importantly, Sparta was also very violent, both internally and externally. From young childhood, you were expected to be constantly training for war. Like I said, very militaristic. If there was ever a warrior culture, it was the Spartans. But at the same time, they were much more egalitarian as a result of that militarism. If you could hold your own in a fight, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, whether you speak ancient Greek or you don't speak ancient Greek, whether you're, incredibly smart or incredibly dumb. As long as you can fight well, you are a Spartan citizen with all of the rights and restrictions that comes with. There's actually a story about how the Spartan queen, who was effectively ruling because her son was too young and had no interest in the throne, and her husband had died, and her, going through the streets of Athens for a diplomatic meeting caused a scandal in Athens. So before you jump in to, defend or criticize either of them, remember that you should be criticizing both and defending both. Just, ancient times generally sucked if you weren't one of the people in power. Just always keep that in mind. And heck, things still suck to an extent if you're not the person in power. It's just that you can, vent and complain and get other people who aren't in power on your side about it. So yes, Athens and Sparta had that big old rivalry. If you are interested in learning more about the geopolitics of ancient Greece, I highly recommend Overly Sarcastic Productions. So, yeah, the Cold War analogy works from a modern perspective, but it's not great. It's not perfect. And, even though they all spoke the same language, albeit with some dialectical differences, the ancient Greeks definitely didn't consider themselves one people. The Peloponnesian War, for instance, nobody considered that a civil war. Which makes a whole lot of fucking sense, actually, when you consider that nationalism as an idea really only came around in the 19th century. That's... So, you can sort of argue about the exact details, but broadly speaking, the concept of nationalism as we now know it, the idea that people have these distinct... that they are unified by language and by culture into a distinct sort of unit. That is very recent. That is not to say that distinct cultures did not exist, but the idea that you should be ruled by people of your own, people, and that sharing a culture makes you united, that is very modern. You could see sort of hints of treading towards that being a formal idea way the heck back, actually contemporary with ancient Greece in the Persian Empire, but, then the guy who founded the empire died and his sons were all assholes, and that's another infodump for another time. But suffice to say, if, maybe if Cyrus the Great had had successors who actually carried on his legacy rather than throwing it in the trash, then perhaps the ancient world would have been much more nationalistic, I guess, and egalitarian from a culture perspective. You gotta hand it to the man. He's the only non-Jewish person to ever have been given the title of Messiah. So he did something right if he was able to, get another people to literally call him their savior. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And we actually saw the ugly sides of what we would now consider nationalism very much in ancient Greece. As I was sort of alluding at before, mostly in Athens, or at least we mostly know about it from Athens, because again, they wrote everything down. Athens had a very, very distinct anti-non-Athens bent, generally speaking. There was this attitude that, if you did not follow Athenian customs, you were lesser. You were a horrible person. You weren't deserving of the same rights that, people who did follow those customs got. And yeah, I like to call that cultural supremacism. It's similar to racial supremacism, but culture. It's similar to religious supremacism, but culture. It's that same sort of idea that if you are part of our in-group, you deserve to rule the world. That is why Athens tried to rule the world, and yeah, kinda can't really say that it's a good thing to think that you're better than anyone else. The only real times in history when all the Greek city-states actually banded together and, cooperated, even if you just say, like, half of them banding together and cooperating, well, that's pretty forced cooperation, like the economic extortion from Athens or the military threats of violence from Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. So the only times that all of them actually banded together, like, voluntarily, and even then it wasn't all of them, just a lot of them, was first, the Trojan War, which we're pretty sure happened. Like, we found the ruins of Troy and whatnot, but we don't know why it actually happened. I mean, our only source for it really is the Iliad, and supposedly there is actually a missing epic poem between the Iliad and the Odyssey that we have lost. So there's probably more information there, but we don't know why, without all the, mythology built up around it, we don't know why the Trojan War actually happened, or really even what actually happened. I mean, there's so much, cultural and mythological symbolism written in the Iliad and the Odyssey that it's kind of hard to tell what is A, literal truth, B, interpreted truth, C, symbolism, and D, outright fabrication. Because, these stories were handed down through the oral tradition for literal millennia before they were actually written down. And even the writing down was a codification by someone else of just the most popular guy's version of it. So, we know that there were different versions. This is just the one that actually survived. So who knows how accurate what we hear in the Iliad and the Odyssey are. I'm going to go ahead and guess not super accurate, but most of it's just, gradual drift from reality over the millennia of oral tradition. Trying to make things a better story, or throwing in symbolism when stuff stops making sense because a cultural touchpoint has been lost, that sort of thing. So that's time number 1. Time number 2, and forwards, was fighting against Persia. Like I said, the Persian Empire is its own whole infodump for another time. I'll probably do a series on the history of democracy, but Persia was the other thing that got the ancient Greeks united. Both sides in each of those wars claimed that the war was defensive, so it's impossible to actually know for certainty who started it. It was probably the Greeks. They did like their subterfuge. At least the first time it was probably them. Can't really say about the subsequent times, but the point is, when it was this sort of defensive war, then they could kind of get together. The sense that, individually, yeah, we're all these tiny little polises, tiny little city-states, but if we band together, we can probably fight back a bigger enemy so that none of us end up getting steamrolled. The little guy banding together, more than this sense of Hellenic nationalism or Greek nationalism. Just, we're all little, that guy's big, he's stomping on some other little guys over there, let's all ball together and try to protect each other. So, yeah, all that to say, Athens was very much the intellectual center of Greece, and just about every ancient Greek scholar had spent at least some time studying in Athens. The ones I talked about last week were pretty much all Athenian themselves. So, why did I bother with this long-ass tangent about the differences between the city-states and the politics and all that? Well, I wanted to give some context for the next big thing that happened, Rome. See, Rome is the whole damn reason why we call the Greeks Greeks. They found some Greek colonies along the boot of Italy and Sicily, and said, you call yourselves this thing that we have corrupted into Graecus. That means you are Graeci. Everyone else who speaks that language must also be Graeci. And so when the Romans found mainland Greece, they just sort of thought of it as this unified people, when in fact it was a shitstorm. Rome's habit of tearing itself the fuck apart can arguably be dated back to the Peloponnesian War, which was Athens and Sparta tearing each other apart. But if you look at, Greece as a sort of unit rather than those broken city-states, yeah, you can kind of see it as Greece tearing itself the fuck apart. Now, to tie everything back to physics. When the Romans conquered Greece, they of course also conquered and incorporated their knowledge. In fact, they were quite eager to acquire Greek scholars. Archimedes was actually killed when his home city of Syracuse was conquered, despite there being standing orders to leave him unharmed so that his genius could be put to use for Rome. And that genius was certainly something. While Aristotle and Pythagoras had created these elaborate systems and equations to describe geometry, Archimedes had built on them, pun intended, to create incredibly complex machines such as the Archimedes screw and compound pulleys, which if you go to a construction site, you can still see today. In a way, despite the focus on the physical manifestations of mathematics, such as geometry and paper and whatnot, Aristotle and Pythagoras can be thought of as the theoretical physicists to Archimedes' experimental physicist. That's actually particularly apt for Aristotle, given his apparent loathing for ever testing anything, ever. Rome was also where Greek mathematics was applied not just to building beautiful structures that corrected for apparent size differences due to distance, but also to practical purposes. The Roman roads and aqueducts are legendary to this day, as are their other incredible feats of engineering like the Colossus, the Colosseum, which was named after the Colossus, the Hagia Sophia, which the conquering Ottomans were so utterly enamored with that they decided to turn it into a mosque rather than knocking it down, the nigh impenetrable walls of Constantinople, which were basically only ever broken down after centuries of complete and utter neglect and improving siege weapon technology, and the Turks having fucking cannons. The Byzantines could have had cannons, but they decided not to pay the guy who developed them to be on their basically military staff, so he went to the Turks instead, and Byzantine Empire lost Constantinople because they didn't want to pay for cannons, which meant that they gave the Turks the cannons. But those walls were incredible. The walls around Rome as well. You hear a lot about Rome getting sacked and whatnot, but usually it was more because someone tricked someone else into letting them in. That's the main way that Rome got sacked, was that sort of infiltration or through sabotage, like sappers. The walls themselves, if you tried to knock them down or scale them, were incredibly difficult to actually get past. So you can start to see how Rome is where ancient Greek architecture starts becoming more than just, oh, this is pretty to look at, and starts becoming more, this is a monument to what can be done by knowing how to put the pieces together. Because, again, the Greeks loved their geometry. The Romans looked at geometry, put it into 3 dimensions rather than just 2. There was, of course, 3-dimensional math before this, but, they actually physically, they took it off the page and put it into reality, and they took the ideas to their absolute extremes. Again, the aqueducts, right? Feats of engineering that were incredibly complicated both for their time and for centuries afterward. The Romans had concrete, which was lost to Europe for millennia, essentially. Well, almost 2 millennia. Well over a millennium. Let's just settle on that. Because, Rome ended up falling and a lot of its knowledge went east instead of west. And Rome built not just incredible feats of engineering and architecture, but also incredible feats of smaller scale physics. You know, you'll constantly hear about all the various incredible construction projects of the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire, but it's also important to keep in mind things like the standardization of equipment for soldiers. That is something that requires a certain amount of mathematical and physical expertise to be able to implement on any scale. Rome just happened to be able to do it, and happened to be militaristic enough to have reason to sink all the effort into doing so. But that is a big reason why they were so effective, was that rather than just ragtag levies, they had an actual professional army with standardized equipment that was made to standardized sizes. Relatively standardized, anyway. Obviously, it was before, machine technology and mechanical engineering and mechanical production and all of that, so you couldn't exactly have, perfectly standardized stuff, like you'd still have hammer marks and whatnot. But the Romans really were, you could say that they had their own sort of industrial revolution. In fact, the Romans, towards the end of the empire, even developed a steam engine. Unfortunately, it never saw use. It was developed far before anything that could actually effectively make use of steam power was developed, and they also had this little thing called slavery, and they also happened to be an entirely agrarian economy. So when you put all those things together, there's no reason for them to adopt the steam engine. As much as I think everyone wishes we had had a steampunk phase of the Roman Empire, sadly, it was never to be. Even if you take away slavery, you still have the problem of, agrarian society. If you take away the agrarian society, you have to completely reinvent the way that Rome paid its troops. If you take away, the lack of things that could effectively use the produced mechanical energy, then you are basically just dragging Rome kicking and screaming into the 19th century. Which, maybe not quite the 19th, but at the very least you're dragging it kicking and screaming into the 10th. Which is a whole lot longer than it managed anyway. Unless, I guess the Byzantine Empire considered themselves Roman, but they didn't have the steam engine. So that's kind of against the point here. Anyway, Rome used those sorts of mechanical feats of engineering and developments to help spread their empire. A lot of the progress that they made seems kind of weird, but, they had stuff like advanced plumbing and sewer systems. Most of the pipes were made out of lead, which helps explain why emperors, seemed to get progressively crazier and crazier. They were just getting worse and worse and worse lead poisoning, and generally just losing their absolute fucking minds. Now, with all that said, I think I am getting about to the end of this video / podcast. I know this one is a little bit shorter. That is just how things worked out. And thank you all very much for watching and or listening. And I will see you all next time.